Hey, welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel here with Dad.
And I'm Rick, and we're glad you're here today. What do you want to talk about today, Joel?
Well, I got one for you. On this podcast, we talk about stuff I learned from you growing up. And I was thinking the other day about there was this period of life where you were kind of working on your own. Technically, we had this organization we were with, but then they brought in this boss and nobody liked him. He was just kind of obnoxious and freewheeling and reckless and wasn't super.
But he knew everything.
He did know everything. Yeah. Well, and he also wasn't very emotionally low EQ, as they say, emotional quotient. So I watched you kind of work under this guy. I watched a lot of guys I respect actually work under this guy, and ultimately he washed out. But I was thinking that really taught me a lot about how to work for horrible bosses, because later on I got one, and I think all of us at some point we have a horrible boss.
Yeah, probably.
And the challenge, there's some stuff in the Bible that I don't like about respecting people and authority and blah, blah, blah. And I don't like it, but it's in there. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about how you have kind of learned to work when you've had a horrible boss. Now, you've mostly been the boss for the last few years. Yeah. And a lot of times there's people that are in CEO leadership roles, and they're the boss technically, but they have a board they're accountable to. And you and I have very strong opinions about boards. One really bad board member can really mess up a board. Yeah. I don't really have fond feelings about boards for the most part, but all that to say, I mean,
people are great. The concept is not biblical.
Let's put it that way. especially for churches, right? Like,
You won't find a church board in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay,
so talk to us about how to work with horrible bosses.
Well, as you said, I've been the boss for the last number of years, so maybe we ought to be bringing in all the people who work for me. Let them talk about what it's like to work with a horrible boss. Well, I remember, the Bible does have a lot, believe it or not.
Let me qualify something, though, too, because a horrible boss can be very subjective. Like, a horrible boss could be somebody who gives you more. That, like, one person could think the boss is great because he gives you every detail of what you want to do. Yeah. And other people would be like, he gives me every detail of what he wants me to do. And then a horrible boss could be horrible because he's like totally open-handed and lets everybody do whatever they want. And some people are like, yeah, that's great. But for the other person, that could be like, oh my gosh, I work in total anarchy, right? Yeah. So it's very subjective to start with.
Of course, there's one other possibility too. If every job you get, you have a horrible boss, you might need to look at what's the common denominator there. Maybe that you're a horrible employee, and maybe that needs to be some changes done there too. Well, again, believe it or not, the Bible really does have a lot to say about an employee-employer relationship. But in the New Testament, we take the verses where it talks about where Paul is giving instruction to slaves as to how they relate to their owner, which actually is even a better application because, of course, the initial thing, well, if I got a bad boss, you got a bad boss. The simple answer is just quit, get a different job. But slaves, of course, don't have that option. And many times we find ourselves in a situation like, and another example was when I was in the military, I had a boss who harassed me a lot because of my faith in the Lord. In fact, I had two of them, the lieutenant who was he would just jokingly prod me and try and undermine my faith by asking me profound college guy questions like, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? But then I had a guy, my direct boss too, who just really was irked by the fact that I was a believer and didn't participate in all the drunken parties that took place on the weekend. And, so I tried to follow what Scripture says,
Which, I mean, that would be kind of the definition of a truly horrible boss. Somebody who dislikes you inherent because of something specific about you, right? Like they're intentionally trying to prod you or irritate you.
Yeah, and he did. He intentionally tried to prod me. And when there was a kind of a bum job needing to be done, I would get that assignment. In fact, it didn't. It worked out to the point that he eventually tried to get me transferred to a place that was going to be a really bad situation. And it turned out to be the hand of God, which it was just a real deliverance situation for me. It was a great deal. And so I found, here's what I found. This is nothing new. It's nothing profound. But if you'll just entrust your ways to the Lord and all your ways acknowledge Him, He will direct your paths, and He's got good things for you. And I think many times he will use that irritating person as sandpaper. You know, as Proverbs says, as iron sharpens iron. And how does iron sharpen iron? If I'm going to sharpen a knife, it's through friction, it's through heat. That's actually sharpening that knife. If I just rub it over a cotton ball, it doesn't sharpen it.
Yeah.
Maybe all warm and fuzzy, but it doesn't sharpen it.
That's actually, I wrote a blog about that this week. My weekly email
Oh, look at that.
is actually about that idea that as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Like, you can't sharpen it without, well, it's got to be from the right angle, first of all.
Right.
But it's actually like rubbing it, and quite uncomfortable, I'm sure, for somebody in the process.
Be uncomfortable for that knife to be sharpened, you know, because again, the right angle, you have to leave that up to the Lord to know when and how much and all that, because he controls that. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, it says. So you can know that your boss's heart is in the hand of the Lord. And then it goes, that proverb goes on to say, and he turns it wherever he will. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he will, like a water course. But you have to remember that a river or water course doesn't change direction quickly.
Yeah.
And so many times it's you that he's working on. The way a river changes direction is either cataclysmic upheaval or just the gradual wearing away of the rocks and of the obstacles in the way of that river. And many times he's working something in our heart and life through that difficult boss. And you know, a real quick testimony, after I got out of the Navy, as you know, I stayed in Corpus Christi. That guy apparently retired there too. I lost track of him. But a number of years later, I heard he had had cancer and died, which I thought was really tragic, and I'd hoped that he'd come to know the Lord. And then I found out that a mutual friend of ours, Jack Carter, had an opportunity to talk to him in the hospital. Pastor Jack in Corpus Christi actually led him to the Lord.
Wow.
And I thought, man, that is awesome. And I want to hope and believe that somehow my influence during that time of not being a jerk in response to him being a jerk, if it didn't increase his possibility of being a believer, at least I didn't do anything negative.
Yeah.
You know, at least it wasn't he had to get over his attitude toward me to become a believer.
That brings up an interesting point, because I noticed something when I started working in certain environments, specifically like the blue collar environment. There's an element of kind of harassment that goes on in blue collar jobs just to see if you can handle it. And I would think the military is the same way, because you want to know if somebody in the military mindset, it's like, are they going to stand with me when stuff gets really hard? So you intentionally make their life hard to try and see. And there's like this bonding that comes where it's like, it's kind of the hazing that goes on.
Yeah.
And, I mean,
So
like,
it's just guy stuff.
yeah, some,
You know.
right. But we
ladies,
also live in this world today where that's abuse. But there's an element of, you want to know if when things get hard, is this person going to tuck tail and run? And I think that's what in the blue collar world too. It's like some of the work is very hard. Some of the times working outside is in the heat is really hard. And they want to know, are you going to wimp out when we need you covering for us?
Are you going to pull your loads a part of it too? You know, you're going to pull your load. Well, you know, that doesn't just happen in the blue collar world. I think it happens, but it's probably more subtle and more
it's a little
snipey.
more abrupt in the blue. Yeah. But I realize that's a lot of it. And so some of it's part of me is I just need to toughen up. And there's an element of, I don't know. I mean, obviously there's a point where it could be like, oh, that's harmful or abusive, but some it's like, suck it up, buttercup. Like, you got to learn how to do this. And I think that's part of it. Sometimes we would, now, should a boss be doing that? I don't know. That's a difficult thing to know. I, as a boss, probably would do it, but I'd have to do it more subtly.
Yeah. Well, it should be and reality are two different things. So whether they should be or not doesn't really matter. If they're doing it to you, how are you going to respond?
Right.
And as I said, Scripture really has a lot to say about it. And I'm thinking of one in Ephesians and one in Colossians, both, where Paul is talking to slaves. And it doesn't endorse slavery. It just, you know, that's the thing. Oh, the Bible endorses slavery. No, it doesn't. Paul is just recognizing, hey, this is the way it is.
Well, and slavery was a given up until a couple hundred years ago. Everybody just assumed slavery would be in the world forever.
Right. Yeah. And it is. It's still around today.
Good point.
It is still in the world today. But he's just saying, this is the way life is, so here's how you deal with it. And what he says, it's a matter of changing your focus. Because what he says, like in Ephesians, is that work hard for that master, not only to win his favor, but recognizing that you're really not working for him, but set your heart and mind to the fact that you're really working, that you're doing this as unto the Lord. And if you do it as unto the Lord, then it doesn't matter whether you get the kudos or the pat on the back or even the raise or anything that you need in this life, because you're doing it as unto the Lord, and meaning that the reward will come when it's payday. And payday's not Friday. Payday's someday, but it's not Friday.
And even if they're making your life hell, you go, well, this is, I'm doing
Yeah.
this as unto the Lord. And so that's
Yeah.
when you can say, I rejoice in my suffering, for I know that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces
Yeah.
character, and character produces hope, right?
Yeah, and also recognizing that God understands the suffering that you're going through, and so He is. I mean, I hate to put it this way, but you're kind of sending treasure on ahead to heaven.
Yeah.
Because He recognizes that you are representing Him, and for that reason, you are responding properly, even when you're being treated wrong.
So let's talk about this. We're not slaves, most of us.
Uh-huh.
We feel like it. How long should you tolerate a bad boss? One, before you just say, I can't do this, I got to leave.
Yeah.
Two, because I talk to people that are like, man, they had panic attacks. Their job was so stressful because
Yeah.
the boss was asking too much. So how much, what's the godly way? Like, do you just tolerate it as like, oh, I'm just going to, for Jesus' name, I'm going to tolerate it. And then the second thing is, if you've got a boss that you can go to the higher level and confront them on some malfeasance or bad they're doing,
Yeah.
should you do that? Should you overlook it? What's your take on that?
Well, you were mentioning earlier that the reason we submit, or the reason we take this attitude, is there's a biblical principle of submitting to authority.
Mm-hmm.
But if, as you say, there's an authority that's higher, it's never, I always hate to use the word never, but I believe it would be applicable here. It's never inappropriate to appeal to that authority, whether you're a direct boss or to a higher authority.
I mean, Paul did that one time when he got whipped, and he's like, hey, you're out of line, mayor.
Right.
And then he appealed to his higher authority, which is his citizenship, right?
Yeah, and he did say, I appeal to Caesar, because he was about to be killed in that situation. He knew he was about, anyway, long story, read it yourself. But he was about to be wrongly killed.
It's in Acts where he's in Philippi, yeah.
And so, just get out your concordance and say, I appeal to Caesar. Look that up and you'll get the whole story. But he appealed to a higher authority.
Hold up. Your concordance. Google. Who uses a concordance?
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, what is Google? Google goes out and checks the concordance. I'm sure Google has Strong's concordance there it looks at.
I don't know.
That's true.
Well, I'm sure somebody's still going.
I'm sorry. I'm from another generation.
Yeah.
That's actually what I would do too, is, hey, Google.
Yeah, all you listeners on podcasts, go grab your concordance.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, I don't even have my concordance. I always say, hey, Siri, where does it say in the Bible? And man, she knows the Bible better than I do.
Yikes.
So, I use her. But anyhow.
So appealing to authority is
appeal to an authority. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not going to put you in favor with your direct authority.
Yeah.
But it's okay to do that. And as far as when would you say enough is enough, I mean, I'd say there's two things. First of all, if the Lord, in your heart, too often we do things without really consulting the Lord. Because He may know this guy's going to get run over by a car next week, or he may quit next week, or whatever, or this guy may come to know the Lord next week. I mean, God knows these things. So too often we just make these decisions based on what I think I want to do, instead of in all your ways acknowledging Him and trusting that He's going to direct your paths. Also a proverb.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would say consult the Lord on it. But then second of all, I think I would probably bail. I would obviously consult the Lord on this, but I think if it's bringing damage to your family, for example, when we moved to Guatemala, we didn't know what we were going to face. I mean, none of us are machete missionaries with the pith helmet out there fighting off the cannibals, So we didn't know if we were going to really be able to deal it down there. So I told your mom, I said, look, if we get down there and this is everything causes stress in a family. Mm-hmm. Ministry causes stress in a family. But if it's causing undue stress that is really beyond, and it's damaging to our relationship to our kids or our relationship to one another, that's undue stress, then we'll just put a little tail between the legs and come home. You don't have to tolerate everything to the point of destroying your family, because, again, that needs to be your primary ministry, caring for your kids, caring for your family, raising them. And if this one is doing unduly stress to them, then maybe it's time, seek the Lord, but maybe it's time to look for something else.